Joining us now is Dr. Jennifer N. Victor of George Mason University. She's an associate professor of political science, and she is also on the board of the Center for
Responsive politics.
Responsive Politics. I'm so sorry. I'm
It's okay.
thinking
Most
about my
people know it as
partisan policy.
open secrets.
Open secrets. Oh, okay, wonderful. I did not realize that was open secrets. But thank you for joining us.
It's got a branding issue.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us today. And hopefully we can figure out that branding issue. And hopefully for everybody who's watching, we've figured it out. So, I'd like to start with a question that has to do with an interview that you did with a colleague of mine, Safia Khan, on Mason votes. You said that, and I'm going to read it here just so that we get it all together. Voting is more difficult because of the pandemic, but many states have made adjustments to their election administration to account for added health precautions and to make voting easier. But some states haven't. And states like Florida, where minorities are having a particularly hard time getting their ballots counted, where, at a 2-to-1 ratio, Black and brown voters are having their ballots disqualified, they have a much higher risk going to the polls because of COVID. 20% of Latinos don't have health care. 11% of Blacks don't have health care. That's versus 6 to 7% of whites. How are people of color supposed to vote in a pandemic that is affecting them so disproportionately?
Yeah, frankly, the advice about how to vote doesn't differ based on demographic, right? So in my opinion, voting by mail is very safe. And if you have health concerns or if you were in a high risk health category, then doing absentee voting or vote by mail, if it's available where you live, is really the safest way to go. Now, you also mentioned that in some communities, people of color have a higher rate of ballot rejection, right? So the problem with voting by mail is it's a little bit more complicated in lots of places than it is if you just walk into the polling place and they hand you a ballot and you fill it out and you scan it and you're done. Voting by mail, often there's little rules. The ballot has to go inside an inner envelope and then an outer envelope. Maybe it has to be signed. Maybe it has to be witnessed. There's just a little bit more rules to it. And they send you this list of instructions that frankly looks pretty intimidating because they want to be detailed and clear, but then it also turns people off and they skip steps. And so these are some of the reasons that ballots wind up getting rejected. So if you're a voter who's worried about not following all the rules or worried about getting your ballot rejected, then it might be better to either get some assistance, like have somebody check your work, or to actually make a plan to go to the polls, either vote early in person, although that's no longer a thing in most places since tomorrow's election day, or whenever, I don't know when this is airing, or to just vote on election day in person. Most places are taking a lot of COVID precautions at their in-person voting, either the early ones or the election day ones, including social distancing and requiring mask wearing. Lots of places have face shields and spacing apart the actual polling booths and all of this type of thing, such that I think most Americans can feel pretty good about their ability to vote safely. I worry a little bit more, particularly on election day, places where the weather is bad and people wind up queuing inside a building. And if you wind up with a crowd of people in an indoor space, it just increases the COVID risk. And so I do worry about that a little bit, but lots of places will have the queuing happening outside. And so that reduces the COVID risk quite a lot. And then with the enforcement of the mask wearing, that helps. One of the things you mentioned Florida in particular, and in a lot of the southern states, including Florida, there's a real tradition in the African American church community about voter mobilization. And different election years, we've seen different levels of enthusiasm and mobilization happening in those communities. But there's often an effort called Souls to the Polls that gets a lot of excitement in the Black church, basically, particularly in the South. And some of the data that I've seen early of the early vote and of some of this folks who go out in there and try to measure levels of enthusiasm have suggested that souls to the polls type efforts have a little bit more enthusiasm behind them in 2020 than they did in 2016. So for people of color who are interested in thinking about more mobilization, that might be a good sign.
Wonderful. So speaking of the South and souls to the polls, actually, there was a bit of a cutback on that, especially in North Carolina, where there were some limitations to early voting in 2018. Those limitations aren't there anymore, but North Carolina is always an interesting state to look at because it's a state of split tickets very frequently. In 2016, we saw Donald Trump get elected at the same time as Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. This year, there's a particularly interesting race happening in the Senate between Tom Tillis and Cal Cunningham. Tillis got COVID, and he's been running pretty far behind generally. He was before that. Cunningham has had a sex scandal all of a sudden. I mean, that was the October surprise of North Carolina. But Cunningham has maintained a healthy, 7-point lead. Is there a chance that Cunningham wins under a Trump ticket along with Roy Cooper maybe winning a second term? Or is it likely that Cunningham could push Biden, who has a much slimmer lead, over the top with North Carolina's 15 electoral votes?
So when we look at the data about ticket splitting and the top of the ballot versus the down ballot races, what we've seen over the last couple of election cycles is a real sort of narrowing or homogenization of that behavior, where very, very few voters these days are more likely to split their tickets. And often whichever party a voter votes for at the top of the ballot will be the same party. Most people are voting straight party tickets, basically. And so often if we're thinking about down ballot races and wondering which way they're going to go, one of the things we can do, one of the signals we can do, is look at how well the candidates are doing at the top of the ticket. It's likely that whichever presidential candidate wins North Carolina, that party's candidates down ballot would be doing better than if the other party had won. Now, to your point though about 2016, we did see some split results. And I think that's a good observation to make to help us remember that as much as, especially as we get into the thick of election results here, there's this tendency to turn everything into a red or a blue and to sort of aggregate up and label states as red states or blue states. But it's really important to remember that regardless of which party winds up with the majority vote in any particular state or in any particular race, there's thousands or millions of the losing party's voters who voted, right? Look at Los Angeles County, right? California is thought of as like the bluest of the blue states. There are more Republican voters in Los Angeles County than there are in the state of Mississippi, right? So every place that you think of as just being red or just being blue has many millions or at least thousands of voters of the other side. And in a place where the races are close, like in places like Florida and North Carolina, you're just going to wind up with more variation because of the tight races.
I'd like to move a little bit further north, and honestly, each of my last couple questions are going to be moving further and further north. I kind of want to bring us home to the Commonwealth first, though, where in the 5th District of Virginia, Congressman Denver Riggleman lost his primary after it was brought to light that he had officiated a gay wedding. So he was primaried by his constituents, and Bob Good became the nominee in what is now the Republican Party of Virginia's stance that they should have a convention rather than a regular primary. And a solid red district is actually looking a lot more swingy. Has the recent adoption of that convention system pushed Virginia's Republican Party a little bit too far to the right for even traditional Republicans? and even, further Tea Party Republicans in areas like the 5th District?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, and Virginia is a pretty interesting case for analyzing this, is there's a real battle right now for the soul of the Republican Party. For all intents and purposes, Donald Trump won that battle in 2016. The battle was very fresh then. Donald Trump won that battle. And essentially over the last 4 years, the Republican Party has become Donald Trump. Like, they are essentially indistinguishable from one another. The National Republican Party didn't even bother to adopt a fresh platform in 2020. That's how much the party is just associating themselves with the brand, with the Trump brand, rather than with some more traditional party faction, ideological or policy advocating type of interest groups that we would think of as part of normal party politics. But if you take a state like Virginia, it's an interesting case because I think it helps us better understand to some extent where this might go in the future. Virginia as a whole has been trending more Democratic over the last number of cycles, largely due to population increases in the Northern Virginia area, like places like Fairfax County. But there's still a very healthy and strong Republican tradition in lots of areas of the state. And so thinking about where the factions are, where are the groups and the elements of the Republican Party that are gaining the most traction in different regions across the state, I think can help us understand where the party might go. And I'm not going to try to presage that. I actually have no idea where the Republican Party is going to go. But I do think a lot is going to hinge on what happens in the 2020 election, right? Which party wins at which levels of government, and how sizable those wins are will create the narrative, the post-election narrative that both political parties will then take and use to help them figure out how to reshape things going forward. There's been a lot of lamentation lately about the Republican Party in the post-2012 period. After Romney lost in 2012, there was a lot of work that Republicans put into thinking about how to reform the Republican Party, how to help expand a Latino base that George W. Bush had started under his presidency, where he had really expanded some Republican loyalties into some Hispanic populations. And there was a lot of thought into changing the Republican coalition at that point. There was a whole playbook actually that was written about it. And essentially that playbook got thrown out and turned on its head by Donald Trump. Because he came in as an outsider. He wasn't really interested in that playbook. He had completely different ideas that were much more populist about where the party should go. And that took off, and that has served him quite well. The data suggest that it may be a minority of the country at this point that identifies with the Republican Party. And to the extent that Republicans have been able to win, it's either because they are a Republican majority in particular localities, or because of the way that Senate election malapportionment and Electoral College malapportionment essentially favor a minority party or give a minority party an advantage. So even if Americans on the whole lean slightly conservative ideologically, on party identification, the majority leans slightly Democratic, which may sound slightly contradictory there. But the Republican Party has been able to capitalize on that by leveraging electoral rules that allow them to maintain power in places where they have an ideological majority, and that they can sort of aggregate up and use to their advantage at the national level.
Now, I had another question about the 5th District, but I think this is a more interesting thing to hit on, which is this conversation about where the Republican Party goes after the 2020 election if Trump loses. And it seems that Republicans have really taken to preempting that loss by talking about the post-2020 election already, saying, well, I'm not sure how we got here. I'm not sure. Like Ben Sass's phone call a couple of weeks ago, where he says we elected, I think he said, a malignant narcissist to the White House. And what were we thinking? Because we're losing our entire the entire base of the Republican Party, and it's being replaced by the Trump base. This lack of confidence in the Republican Party seems to be really hurting it in the last few weeks, but also that preemptive strike to say we're going to bounce back. What does a bounced back Republican Party look like after a candidate that is, despite, in many cases being seen as being seen as destructive, Donald Trump has really become the face?
Yeah, I think it's going to hinge on, so if Trump in fact loses, I think one of the things we're going to want to look at is the size of that loss, because if it's a narrow loss, if we're looking at 160 million voters turning out in this election, and he's gotten 50 million or more of them. Oh wait, that didn't add up right. 75 million or more of them. Such that it's basically pretty close. Then that tells the Republican Party that Trumpism is still alive and well, and may provide them, with some slight tweaks here and there, some paths to victory in the future. Keep in mind, if Trump loses, he's eligible to run again, right? So he would be a prime candidate for 2024. Age might become a little bit of a problem at that point, but America will have elected their oldest president ever with Biden at that point. So maybe it's less of an issue. Wait, I had another thought. However, on the other hand, I guess, is if the loss is larger than that, if the Republicans come away feeling really defeated, and that is not just having lost the White House, but lost it by a wide margin, if they also lose the Senate, and maybe Democrats even pick up some House seats, then I think you create the space for recalibration. The Lincoln Project Republicans sort of stand up and start saying, "I told you so," and make some efforts at trying to rebuild the Republican Party. I'm dodging your question a little bit here, because the hard part of your question is, what does that look like? Like, if there is rebuilding, what direction do they go? And I think that's hard to say. There's still some room to go back to the George W. Bush playbook and to think about the demographics, the changing demographics of the country, and some conservatism, some natural conservatism that exists in a lot of populations of people of color that the Republican Party could try to capitalize on. I also think there's a huge opportunity for both political parties to try to really tap into a really strong wave of populism. There's economic populism that is gaining traction on the left and on the right. We saw it with the attraction to Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party. We see it with the attraction to Donald Trump in the Republican Party. But despite all of that interest in some sense of economic justice or economic redistribution, or paying closer attention to the everyday American rather than to the wealthy elite, neither political party has done very good at actually speaking to that population. Trump speaks a good game there, but none of his policies actually benefited that population. And so eventually that will catch up with the Republican Party. So in a way, I think both political parties could capitalize on that by actually enacting policies that got the attention of that population. It just, I think, remains to be seen how exactly that happens, and then how it gets marketed. I could also see a case where maybe Democrats come into power and they pass some wealth redistribution policies that should be of interest to some of that population, but Republicans label it socialist. And so you get this sort of cross-cutting identity and policy issues that don't match up very well. And that creates a little bit of political chaos that might be interesting to follow down the road.
Absolutely. And a speed round question, because I know you have to go. But a couple of days ago, you tweeted a picture of an electoral map. And that electoral map showed Minnesota as a swing state. Now, Minnesota is an old school labor state. It's been a Democratic stronghold for quite a while. What are you seeing out of Minnesota that folks at home might not be seeing?
So that particular map that I made on that day, it was about a week ago maybe, what I did was I went into all the states that were swing or leaning, and looked at the latest polls. And then I dug into the polls to find the margin of error. And if the candidates were outside the margin of error, like the confidence interval, if there was actually daylight between them, then I sort of colored the map to call it for one candidate or the other. The problem, and this problem has since been fixed because there are more recent polls now out of Minnesota. But on the day that I was doing that, at least, the only decent poll from a decent pollster that we had out of Minnesota had a 5-point margin of error around it. They just didn't have the biggest sample. And so their margin of error was big. And so in order for me to have called the state for Biden, there would have to have been more than 10 points between the two candidates because that margin of error was so large. And while Biden is ahead, and I do expect Biden will probably win Minnesota, and I think actually more recent polls support that. We've got better polls now that show smaller margin of error with that, and still Biden well enough ahead. That I think if I was doing that same exercise today, I probably would be coloring it blue. But I really think it's important to look at the margins of error. That's one of the things I talk about with my students a lot.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know we've gone a little bit over, and I know
That's
you
okay.
have to get going, but thank you so much for joining us, and your insight's been really helpful. So hopefully people at home are watching and they're learning a little something in between the results coming in, because this is airing on Tuesday. So
great. Well, I'm very happy to be with you, and I'm busy and doing a lot of things these days, but I like prioritizing students. So don't hesitate to reach out again if you'd like to have a follow-up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. You take care.
You too. Bye-bye.